Hello. We made this movie to introduce you to safe shelter construction principles regarding specific hazards existing in Namibia. We will guide you along some of the existing hazards, providing you with some suggestions on site selection, meaning where your shelter is located, and possible protection measures and construction techniques to minimize risks. When building a shelter, you have to be careful and be aware of existing hazards that might occur in the area. It is advisable to avoid building in a hazardous area. If still not possible to avoid, it is important to adapt your shelter to existing hazards. This can be done either while constructing a new shelter or while upgrading an existing shelter. We will now go through the most common existing hazards to shelter in Namibia, explaining possible consequences and providing simple suggestions for site selection in relation to specific hazards. Landslides. A landslide is a geological phenomenon which includes a wide range of ground movement, such as rock falls, deep failure of slopes, and shallow debris flows. This phenomenon usually is associated with heavy rain, pre-existing slopes, and other conditions such as lack of ground vegetation and trees that help to secure the hill slope in place. If a shelter is located on the immediate top of an unstable hill when a landslide occurs, it is at risk of collapse along with a mass of land and rocks along the hill. It is equally risky to have a shelter located on the bottom of an unstable hill. The major risk is associated with collapse of the shelter due to the mass of land or rocks that may slide down the hill with the landslide. The shelter may thereby be severely damaged. When building a shelter located on higher ground or at the bottom of a hill, leave a safe distance from the edge and the bottom of the hill. Recommended practice is a minimum of 50 meters. This will create a safe area in between the shelter and the unstable hill, minimizing the risk of the shelter to potential landslides. Flooding. A flood is an overflow of water that submerges or drowns land. Flooding may be understood as a covering by water of land not normally covered by water. Floods often cause damage to shelter if they are located in the natural floodplains of the rivers. Low lands next to or close to rivers are most likely to suffer flooding. Shelters located in these areas are at risk of damage or destruction if water levels of the river rise to cause flooding. To minimize the risks, it is advisable to build on higher ground. It is important to know the approximate water levels in times of flooding to use as guidance. Previous floods can help you identify the level of risks. The shelters can then be located on higher ground at a safe distance from the traditional floodplains. Fires. Fires are a result of a combination between very dry conditions and high temperatures. Fires may also result from human behavior leading to damage or destruction of shelters. Typical characteristics of a fire are flames accompanied by smoke and extreme heat. The major risk to shelter in relation to fires is the short distance between different shelters. This increases the risk of fire spreading from house to house and having the fire causing damage or destruction to multiple shelters. One way of minimizing these risks of fire is the creation of fire breaks between different shelters. It is also recommended to clear the surrounding area from vegetation, such as bushes and small trees. This will also help in minimizing the fire risks to your shelter. High winds. Winds of extraordinary power, force and speed are considered as high winds. High winds may cause damage or destruction to shelter and environment. It is important to understand if a site is exposed to very high winds. A shelter located in such areas may suffer damage or even destruction if built next to a tree that might fall down due to the wind. When possible, try to build in an area that is sheltered from the prevailing wind direction. Protective actions. We will now move on to explore protective actions that may be useful when building a safe shelter. First tip: raising the shelter. Building on stilts. Building on stilts is advisable when possible and appropriate. This technique can be a solution for shelters located in flood-prone areas. It will minimize the risk of having the house inundated by rising floodwaters and help protect the shelter. Second tip: raising the shelter. Building a platform. Another option is to raise the shelter on an earth platform. It is advisable to compact the earth, stabilizing it with a small portion of cement if possible, and build the shelter on top of this platform. There are also other techniques to raise your shelter. Another possible approach is to build your platform with wooden poles. This will also protect your shelter from rising water levels. Third tip, building an external platform. It may not always be possible to raise a shelter, especially not with an existing structure. In these cases, it may be good to consider other measures. One suggestion is to build a raised platform next to the shelter, which can temporarily and safely accommodate people and their belongings in the event of flooding. Fourth tip, surrounding vegetation. Advisable for any kind of shelter construction is to consider the surrounding vegetation. If located close to a riverbank, planting lines of trees along the riverside will create obstacles to flood water, reducing water speed and force. Although it may not prevent the water from reaching the shelter, this will help slow down the water, reducing its force of impact over the shelter and thereby minimizing the risk of a collapsed shelter. If not possible to plant trees and use vegetation along the riverside, it is also possible to build protective barriers around the shelter. The use of recycled materials may be an option for this, such as oil drums or tires filled with compacted sand and laid in line. Again, although it may not prevent the water from reaching the shelter, this can serve as a protective action against more severe damage. Construction tips. The last part of this video will focus on key suggestions when constructing a shelter for increased stability and reduced risk of damage. We will specifically look at foundations and walls. Before building a shelter's foundation, it is important to understand the type of soil over which the shelter will be built. Digging the soil along the location of the future foundation will allow one to know the type of soil. You can dig the holes in 4 to 5 different places. Holes should be at least 2 meters deep to allow a proper assessment of the soil type. The type of soil is important for the stability of the shelter. Neither sand soil nor clay soil is suitable for construction of the shelter, as they are too soft and thereby unstable for the foundation. The shelter may crack, collapse or sink into the soil. If no alternative is available to sand and clay soil, a deep and wide foundation should be built to at least minimize the risks. However, recommended is a harder type of soil found on more rocky terrain. This provides a more stable base for the foundation of the shelter. Although it can be a lot of work to dig the foundation, it is still the most suitable for the construction of shelter. For increased stability, it is important that the shelter's foundation is deep enough to manage the weight of the building and to avoid potential collapse or damage. It is recommended to ensure that the top part of the foundation is a minimum of 60 centimeters below the ground level. The bottom part of the foundation, as well as its size, will depend on the size and weight of the building. The shelter's stability is also linked to the construction of the walls and its level of reinforcement. A simple wall structure without reinforcement is at risk of damage and collapse due to side pressure resulting from wind and flood water. The bracing of a wall structure allows the increase of structural resistance. By placing a diagonal connection within the structure frame, it is possible to increase the structural capacity to withstand side forces that might result from high winds or flood water pressure and weight. This will help in reducing the risk of collapse or severe damage of the shelter. That was the end. We hope that you have learned a few useful suggestions for safer shelter. Please note, this video has only mentioned a few tips on site selection, protective actions, and construction techniques. We hope that you have been inspired to learn more about safe shelter construction to avoid the risks of hazards to your home and your family. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.